Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Harjeet, for the introduction, and John and Madeline, thank you for your good company. We've had most of the interesting discussions before I get up to speak, so this will seem quite tame, I think, in comparison. If you know Madeline, you know exactly what I mean. I thought I'd just maybe talk for 15 or 20 minutes and give you about the same length of time, if that suits the rules of the club, to ask me questions about what is important to you, because otherwise I might be talking about things that are only on the margins. A little bit about myself, apart from what Harjeet has told you. I'm born and bred Aucklander. I was born in a little maternity hospital on Mount Eden Road. And it later became a rest home, and I thought, this is great, I can go full cycle. Unfortunately, they've demolished it and it's intensive housing now. Brought up in Three Kings, Mount Roskill, and then Papatoetoe, went to Papatoetoe High School. Went on to Auckland University. In the meantime, my father, who's still alive, lives in Howick here. I should mention my connections to Howick. My mother is a permanent resident in Howick now. She's at the cemetery in Star of the Sea, and she always loved the sea, so that was the place that she wanted to be buried. Lives in Somerville. My niece was born just across the road. There used to be a maternity hospital as well. Some of you will remember that. Yeah, well, I can tell her. The trouble is she now lives in the United States. She came back to New Zealand. She played for 5 years for the New Zealand women's football side, but she's a mother of 4 young American babies. And my sister lived just down past the Shamrock Cottage. She is now in the States and she had a daughter and 4 sons, one of whom very sadly was killed in Afghanistan, fighting in the American Army, and the other 3 boys have all, they're West Point graduates and have served or are still serving in the American Army. So it's good to be back in Howick. I feel like I'm at home here. In fact, you'd be interested to know the last time I was in this room was about a month ago, and it was the seniors branch of the National Party that I was speaking to. And that was quite a compliment to me to be invited to speak to the seniors branch of the National Party. And we had a really, really good meeting. And right in the audience, sitting where you are just there, was my former headmaster from Papatoetoe High School. So, yeah, headmasters, Hugh Richards. Yeah, headmasters always have this influence on you, even though, you know, even though you're a grown adult, somehow you always have to defer to your former headmaster. Anyway, at age 16, I was not so politely asked to leave home by my father, who's a very stubborn, old school type person. So I made my way in the world when I was still at school. I worked in the freezing works for 7 seasons and then put myself through university. Actually, I think my dad did me a great favour. I learnt something about self-reliance. I also learnt from working in the freezing works why I wanted to get an education, and I wanted to get a job that stimulated me mentally rather than just exhausted me physically. I don't know whether any of you have ever worked on a production line or the freezing works, but by the time you've skinned your 9,000th kidney for the day, you realise that the only thing that you're doing at work is getting a paycheck at the end of the week that you can live on. And every year I'd come out of my university exams. I would really love the first 3 weeks at the freezing works because I didn't have to think, and then I could go home, leave the job behind me. And for the 3 weeks before I went back to university, I just couldn't wait to get back and to learn and to be active. But the guys on the chain taught me something. They taught me that they were paying tax to give me a free education. And I considered myself really part of a lucky generation. My dad and his brothers all served in the Second World War. My grandma was English. Her husband served in the First World War, was gassed on the Somme, captured, came here, was a tram driver in Auckland and died in 1934. That was at the height of the recession. And Madeline wanted to know why I'm Labour, because in 1935 this lovely gentleman called Michael Joseph Savage came along and gave my grandma a shilling a week extra in the widow's mite that she got, but gave her hope. And that was the most important thing that could have done. And my dad, at 95, still thinks that Michael Joseph Savage walked on water. So it was about fairness. But that generation went through some hard times, and kind of, if I look around, probably I can I say our generation? Yeah. Apologies to the younger people that are here, but we were the lucky generation. And the area I grew up in Three Kings was really interesting. Next door neighbour was a First World War vet, and he had a wooden leg, and as a 5 and 6 year old I used to go and tap on the leg because it made a hollow sound. But you know, they went through hard times. We were baby boomers, and we got the benefit of what all of our service personnel sacrificed for. We didn't go through that depression. I was the first kid in my family ever to go to university, and I thought that I owed something back to my community. So I decided quite early on I wanted to look at politics as a career. I started teaching. I was a university teacher for a while. That was nice, but I didn't want to analyse the world. I wanted to change the world. I still do. I'm just realised it takes a bit longer now than I thought when I first started off in politics. And so I was selected at age 27 to run in the Mount Roskill seat for Parliament. I had a sabbatical after 1990, 3 years out. Had the great fortune to get a scholarship to Oxford during that time and to set up a teaching course at AUT. But I've really enjoyed my parliamentary service. What makes me want to go into local government? Now, that's a very familiar question. My wife asks me that each night when I come home late. Birthday or no birthday this week, I'm out every night in the week. Tomorrow I think I've got five meetings. But I think we're incredibly lucky in Auckland. You know, you've just got to look out over Howick and think what a fantastic place this is to live in. You know, that we're on the coast. God knows how those Americans that live in the Midwest that are thousands of miles from water live. I couldn't live like that. We've got a beautiful environment. The Gulf is the jewel in the crown, and the harbour, the mountains, the Hunuas out where I live, and the Waitakaris. It's a great city. The climate, we were complaining it was a bit cool outside, but hey, this is the middle of winter. This is the winter solstice, and it was 15 degrees out there. We're doing pretty well compared to many countries. But it's also the nature of the city that I think is really special. We used to be a large provincial city. Today we're a small global city, and because of our scale, we have choice and opportunity. There's a guy that I hugely admired by the name of Sir Paul Callaghan. You might have heard of the Callaghan Institute. They named it after him. He was a physicist, he was a university academic, he was an entrepreneur. And he wrote this wonderful book called From Wool to Weta. Weta not being that horrible little creature that we have to look after and not stand on, but Weta Digital. And he said that the goal that we can have for our country, and we should have for our country, is to make this country a place where talent wants to live. And I think Auckland is the city that can do that. You know, for years and years, we've watched our kids drain out of New Zealand, go and live in Sydney and Melbourne, in Brisbane, Los Angeles, London. Okay, it's reversed for a time, and I say for a time because, you know, when the Australian economy recovers, we're going to have that competition again. And I think Auckland can be the city where the best and brightest of our young people can say, okay, maybe we don't want to grow up, with no insult to the towns I'm naming in Wanganui or Rotorua or Hamilton, but Auckland is the bright lights. Auckland is the city in New Zealand that gives us the chance to specialise, to do things, to live in an exciting and vibrant city. And Auckland is becoming increasingly important. I had a telephone conversation this afternoon with the Minister of Transport, Simon Bridges, and I thought the thing that I really achieved in that was to hear Simon, as the Member of Parliament for Tauranga, saying, you know, we all want Auckland to succeed because if Auckland doesn't succeed, New Zealand can't. And I've been saying that in Parliament for as long as I can remember. And usually the reaction, you know, south of the Bombay Hills, you bloody Jaffers, you know, you get too much. I mean, you'll hear Winston saying it all the time now that he's got a provincial seat. But the truth is, if we don't succeed in Auckland, then New Zealand is going to be held back. We are 35% of the country's population, with 37% of the country's production. So there is a vested interest in New Zealand, in Auckland doing well. They just haven't quite realised it yet. And the new Mayor of Auckland is going to have to persuade the rest of New Zealand about that, as well as a government of either colour. But this is the city that I think can be really special for New Zealand. This is a city that can lead in technology. It can be a centre of learning, a centre for events. It's already a tourist city, 3.3 million tourists a year coming to New Zealand now. And guess what? 90% of them spend at least one night in Auckland. And you know, you don't have a rapid transit system from the airport to the city and back again. Is there any country, any city that calls itself a truly international city that doesn't provide that? And we've got other problems as well. And you know, if we look realistically at what I think the major problems in Auckland are, the first is traffic congestion. I can usually get into town from where I live in Ardmore. I've got a small farm out in Ardmore in 35 minutes. But if I choose the wrong time of the day, it's an hour and a half. And increasingly, there are more and more wrong times to the day. You know, when I go to a meeting, I'm either half an hour early because, surprise, it wasn't congested, or I'm half an hour late because the congestion was even worse than what I anticipated. And that congestion is costing us dearly. You know, the Productivity Commission and the New Zealand Council for International Development say that the cost of the productivity loss and the total cost of congestion is about $1.5 to $3 billion a year in Auckland. Now, you know what that means? It means that you take your bundle of say, up to $3 billion and you tip it down the drain. You might as well, because you get absolutely nothing back from it. And my argument has always been, if we can waste that much each year in lost productivity, why couldn't we invest that much to stop the loss in productivity? Sounds a bit simple, but actually fundamentally it's true. We've got to get this city moving. And I was welcoming a report that came out today that I was discussing with the Minister of Transport on the, it's called the Auckland Transport Alignment Project. And good on the Minister. For the first time last year, he decided that it's time that Auckland Council and central government work together to try to resolve the problem. You know, before that, what did we have? We had the rail loop, the city rail link, and the report came out and the homework had been done and the government said, no, we're not interested in that. And the Prime Minister was down there cutting the ribbon last week, proud as punch. And it's great that they've started it. The trouble is that will be here by 2023. Now, every year you must notice, as I noticed, that the roads get worse. Do you know why that is? Last year we added 42,000 cars to the road in Auckland, 42,000. We are growing each week in Auckland by 825 people, and they've got to get around the place. And in the 50s we decided that we would build a city based on the motor car. And we pulled up the tram routes. Anybody here remember trams? Yeah, I remember. I was very little at the time, mind you. But trams used to carry, I think it was 70 million passenger trips a year. It wasn't until the year before last that public transport came anywhere near to matching that, even though the population in the 50s was a quarter of what it is now. So what are we going to do? If we build more motorways, which is traditionally how we've done things, more cars go on the motorways to fill the motorways. What we have to do is say to people, we are going to provide an attractive form of public transport where you will opt to take public transport rather than a car. Now that's a little bit hard for us culturally, right? But you know, once in London, I tried to drive my car across the city. Twice I tried to do it in New York, and only once when I was studying at Oxford. And I quickly learnt, if you've got an effective, efficient public transport system, why would you bother? Why would you bother getting through the congestion? Why would you bother paying a fortune for your parking and spending hours looking for a car park? You do what comes naturally. But at the moment, or up till now, we haven't had a good public transport system. So what will the City Rail Link do? It will double the capacity of rail. And that's really important. When you've got a terminal, the train has to go out by the same rail that it came in on. If you've got a loop, it can go around and you've got much more capacity. Britomart will be congested by next year. That's what the figures show us. Busways. Are you familiar with the North Shore busway? I know we're not on the North Shore. It's fantastic. You sit on the motorway, stuck in your car, and you watch the buses whiz by, and you think, this is dumb, I'm going to catch a bus. And we were talking about the Harbour Bridge before, I think. was it John? I might have been talking about the Harbour Bridge too. There are just as many people that go into town from the North Shore now by bus as go in by car, because it's convenient and it makes sense. I believe that we've got to have light rail. I can't think of a big city in the world that has a successful transport system that doesn't have a metro or a light rail. One light rail unit carries 400 people, 400 to 500 people. That's the equivalent of 10 buses. I went on one of those double-deckers. Anybody been on the double-decker yet? Yeah, I mean, it's quite good. You sit up the front there like a big kid and look out over the city, and it's good. But we've got bus congestion now, 146 buses an hour on Simon Street. That's bus congestion. What do you do then? Well, I think that we're going to have to do, and you know what Auckland Transport has said is probably follow the same routes ultimately as the trams used to. Funny that, eh? But we need light rail. I think it'll be light rail to the airport. It's $1 billion cheaper than heavy rail. It's got to be part of the mix, and for the first time in the report out today, the government has kind of implicitly rather than explicitly acknowledged that. Cycleways and walkways. You know, I used to laugh a bit at that. I thought it was a greenie thing. I think I'm wrong. How many people here used to ride their bike to school? Hands up, please. Yeah, that's about 90%. 1989, it had dropped to 19%. You know what it was last year? 3%. Now, we've got a problem with our kids today, is that they eat the wrong foods and they don't do enough exercise. Actually, riding the bike to school used to be a form of exercise. But parents, you know, I understand why parents don't want their kids to bike to school, because the roads are so dangerous. What we're building through Mount Roskill at the moment, we've taken away all the berm and we've built a triple-size footpath, which will be a walkway and a cycleway between the schools and the community. And what we're trying to do is entice kids. I'm talking about teenage kids when I talked about the 3%. It's not just not the littlies, it's the teenagers. Try to entice their parents to say, look, it is safe for you to ride your bike to school. If we got the kids to go back to riding their bikes to school, we would reduce traffic volumes by 10%. That makes a difference, and the kids would be getting the exercise that we know that they need to get. So there are other solutions in transport. I met with a lady called Victoria Carter. You may have heard of her. She used to be a councillor. She does a car share business. It's pretty small. It's 30, and the car share is you hire it by the hour. You pick it up from a place and you take it back to the place. But in a place like Vancouver, they've got about 3,000 car shares. And car shares, for every car share on the road, you take 9 other cars off it. When you next drive on the motorway, I guarantee if you look at the cars around you, you'll find that 90% of those cars have one person in it. It is hopelessly inefficient to do what we're doing at the moment, even though I do it every day myself, except when I ride my motorbike. On a really bad day when I think I'm going to be stuck in traffic and I've got a Paul Henry interview in the morning and I can't afford to be late, I hop on my motorbike and, you know, one of those annoying people that go up the middle and I get there on time. But that's not everybody's preference. So car sharing, Uber's quite interesting. The way that Uber will work, where people will car share and cut the costs. Instead of paying a prohibitive taxi fare, you'll be paying a fare if there's 2 or 3 sharing the vehicle that makes it just as cheap to get into town car sharing as taking your own car in. So there are solutions there. What we have to do is adopt those solutions, and then we've got to fund them. And I'll come back to funding in a minute. Now, somebody, John or Madeline, can you just tap on the table when you want me to shut up? Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. I get John. I meant to say John. The second big problem is housing. I've got 3 kids. They all live in the city. One daughter's just come back from London. She's single. Anybody got a son that's looking for a 30-year-old wife that's getting fussier by the day? And she says, Dad, I got no show as a single person of buying a house in Auckland. And actually that's true. Our 2 boys have got homes of their own. One's out in Pukekohe, one's in Papatoetoe. And guess what? How did they get into a home? Mum and Dad provided the mortgage. How many of you here provide help for your kids for mortgages? Probably, yeah, look, almost everybody does that can. You know, if you did not choose your parents well, it's your own damn fault you can't get into a house. You know, the sad thing is, I've always believed in the Kiwi dream of home ownership. You know, it was fantastic. I did flatting for a while, about 5 or 6 years I was, after I'd left home. But having your own home that you can call your own, that you can do work on, that's stable, nobody's going to give you notice, you can improve the value of it, you can plant trees. Of course that's the Kiwi dream, but it's becoming really hard. You know that Auckland is now the 4th least affordable city in the world. We are less affordable income compared to prices than London or Los Angeles. It's not my figures, that's the economist's figures. When I bought my first home, I paid $12,500 for a little house in Wilmay Avenue, Papatoetoe, and I thought that was pretty steep. How could I ever pay that bill back? But actually it was 2.5 times my university teaching salary. Today, kids buying their first home are generally paying 9 times their household income. So, we like to complain a bit about how hard things were, and my mum and dad used to say when we first got married we sat on butter boxes and a table that dad had built, and and there's some truth to that. But actually it's really tough for kids today in Auckland. And it bothers me. Look, if you were to ask me what's the best thing I could invest in, if you'd asked me that say 2 years ago, I would have had to say, if I gave you an honest answer, a house. Value going up, it's solid, it's predictable, it's tax deductible, everything. I'm not quite sure that that's right now. I was reading a piece in the paper by a guy called Brian Gaynor the other day. You might have heard of run Milford Investments, I think it's called. Brian used to work with me when he was David Longie's economist. And he said in this article, the housing market today is a little bit like the share market in 1987. Everybody says, I've bought more shares, and look at my shares have gone up by this amount, I'm really rich, and as if it could never go down. What Gaynor was saying, and I think he's right, and Ollie Newland was saying the same thing, he's a long-time property investor, he said that the bigger the bubble gets and the faster it grows, the greater the prospect of that bubble deflating. And when that happens, that's going to leave people without equity in their homes. If they've bought homes in the last 5 years, you'll have a mortgage bigger than your house. Unlike the Americans, you can't give your keys back to the bank and walk away. You are saddled with that debt. But it's going to have such an impact on people and stopping consumption and spending that we'll go into a depression. Now, I hope that doesn't happen. I'm not trying to scaremonger, but I'm saying that becomes more and more of a prospect the bigger we let this speculative boom go. And when I read in the Herald that one house that was bought at the beginning of last year for $325,000 passed through 5 sets of hands and sold at the end of last year for $630,000, I say we've got a real problem in our community. Some poor person at the end of that chain of speculation will spend 50 years paying off what a whole lot of people made in quick money in a matter of months by doing nothing. Now, I don't think you can build a wealthy country like that. What I'd like to be able to advise you, if I was your financial advisor, was that the best thing we as New Zealanders could do at our age, when we've got money that we have saved and can invest, would be in productive enterprises. That's what would make the country wealthy. Speculation doesn't do it. But can you blame people for doing it if it's there? And the answer is probably not. But nothing much has been done about that. These are central government solutions, but I think the government is going to have to... They brought in a bright line test. It lasts for 2 years, where you have to pay income tax on your capital gain. I think you could actually probably justify at the moment, just to bring that pressure down and stop that balloon bubbling out the way that it is. I think you could bring in far more far-reaching things than that. I think the banks have got to stop lending. The value to the loan-to-value ratio has got to be changed so that it's harder as an investor to borrow a whole lot of money and leverage off that to make a fortune. I just think if we don't do those things, we're all going to pay for it. It's not a real world out there. But let's have a look at what we'd do for housing. I think you've got to deal with that speculative pressure at the moment. I don't think you need to let non-residents buy into the existing housing market. The Aussies say to foreign investors, you want to invest in housing in Australia? Build a unit. You're adding something to our country. And you'll make some money out of that, but you're adding something. At the moment, a non-resident investor coming into New Zealand will buy an existing house and make a fortune out of it, but Actually, have they added anything to the New Zealand economy? And my answer is no. Secondly, I think it's a supply issue. I think that we've got the lowest ratio of social housing per capita in Auckland since 1949. There are people out there that will never find homes on their limited incomes. And if you're running a business, I don't know how the hotels in Auckland are going to employ people, because if you're paying them $17 an hour and they're renting and it's costing $600 for a house for their family in Auckland, they don't have any money left. They can't afford to be here. So I think you've got to have social housing. I think you've got to have affordable housing. Nobody builds. You don't remember the days of Neil housing and Keith A housing? Nobody builds affordable houses today because the land is so expensive. We've got to make sure there's an adequate supply of land. I think we have to go up and out. Where would I go up? Who's been around Panmure to see the new bus rail interchange? Stand up there and you're 10 minutes from town at that interchange and look around. What do you see? Do you see houses? No, car yards. Exactly. Acres and acres of car yards. Now, if I was planning Auckland, I'd say, wouldn't that be an ideal area for intensive housing? You know, maybe put it up. You either do 3 stories or you do 7 stories, because it's probably not very economic to do anything in between. You've got to put out lifts in. But that's an area where you could have intensive housing. Good design, open public space. You've got Mount Wellington right there. That's the most underutilised space I've seen. Could be fantastic. People close to town. So they're not hopping on the roads to get into work. They're hopping on the train or the bus. That would make sense. Glen Eden is the same. Go down Glen Eden, right next to the railway station, ribbon development, pretty shoddy shops really. I hope you don't have a shop in Glen Eden. Go behind it to the old shopping centre. It looks like a refugee camp. I mean, that's another area where you could build. You look at the Merchant Quarter in New Lynn. Underneath you've got the cafes and the shops. On top people live. That's actually how people live in big cities all around the world. Not my thing. I'm out on my 20 acres. So I'm not preaching to you that you should do this, but for some people it suits to do that. So I think you've got to look at that sort of solution. I want to mention this one as well, and I don't want to sound like Winston Peters, because I'm not. I'm a strong believer in immigration. I think we bring in talent and energy and diversity and enrichment. But can you have 70,000 people coming into New Zealand at the moment, a year, record levels, without the provision of the transport and the housing services that sort of growth requires? And my argument to government is, if you want to keep up an open-ended immigration policy, for God's sake provide the infrastructure so that you don't diminish the quality of life of everybody in the city because you've got congested roads and unaffordable houses. I think, you know, traditionally what all governments did, of any political shade, is you'd say, we've got really a lot of pressure on immigration at the moment, and we've got the Kiwis coming back as well. So what we'll do is we'll lift the threshold for permanent residency. So we run a point system. That'll slow it down a bit. We might stop providing as many work visas, temporary work visas as we are, or the working holiday scheme. But I think you've got to look at the demand side as well. I just don't think it's realistic to say we can keep on packing people in before we've found solutions to our transport and our housing. And it's not a radical thing I'm saying, it's actually a very orthodox thing. I just think we should be doing that. Okay, I'm running out of time now, so I'm going to do 2 other things. I wanted, one, say, why am I running as an independent? I'm a Labor person, you all know that. I've been a Labor person for as long as you can remember. And am I going to change my values now? No, I'm pretty centrist. You ask any national MPs, they say, yeah, Goff's okay to work with, he's not nutty. There's a guy that came in after Mao in China called Deng Xiaoping. And I really admired Deng because, you know, the Cultural Revolution under China, the country was a bloody mess. And Deng came in, threw out the Cultural Revolution stuff and said, in a very Confucian way, I don't care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And that's kind of my philosophy on life. Evidence-based policies, not stupid things. Keep an open mind, be innovative, don't be ideology bound, and try to win consensus and majority support for what you're doing if you want it to last. So that's been my approach in politics. I will deal with governments of either political colour if I'm mayor, and so it doesn't make sense for me to play political games. I've told Phil Twyford, You know, you might like what I'm saying now. When you're minister, you might not like what I'm saying, but I'm going to be saying the same thing. Views. I know Bill Cashmore in South Auckland here. I've known his family for years. I can work with him. Penny Webster was an ACT MP in Parliament with me. I can work with her. Desley Simpson, who's probably going to be elected in Ōrākei. She's married to the President of the National Party. We get along fine. They're all people that are actually quite talented people, and that's all I want. I want people that are prepared to work for the good of Auckland, and I don't want to have political games of any sort. That might be naive. Organising your councillors might be like herding cats, but I'm ready to take on the challenge. The last thing I want to say is, council, we had the amalgamation. Why? Because we could create an economy of scale, we could get efficiencies, we could avoid waste and duplication. Have we done that yet? And my view, heavily influenced by talking with John about bureaucracy and culture in council, I think we've got to change that culture. I think we've got to learn to do more with less. We've got to learn to be efficient. So basically, there's 1,000 other issues, but those are, I think, are the central issues facing us. Those are the changes that I'd like to make. I'd really like to think that with the skill and experience I've built up in politics, I can make a difference for Auckland. It'll be frustrating. It'll drive me nuts at times, but I hope that I'll get the satisfaction of leaving Auckland, if I'm given the job, a better place than I found it. Thank you very much. Stand up here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Phil. He has agreed to take questions, so if you have a question, would you mind, I have been asked by Matthew, would you mind coming to the microphone, please, so that your question
Oh, that makes it hard.
So, you know, hello, we have one. Of course, Deborah, please.
Sheep and goats.
Can you hear me?
Yep, yeah, I can hear you fine.
Thank you very much for what you've said. Living out in East Auckland, have you thought about the public transport getting out here? Because it seems like we've got a very poor public transport system, and that will prevent people from living here.
Yeah, I think it is hard here, and I mean, some of the plans that they've got, the Amity plan is one that we've got to see through to fruition, which will link Panmure to Pakuranga to Botany. Ultimately, we will have, I think, if you've ever been down Taurarangi Drive and wondered why all the roads are so wide and the palm trees planted in the middle, that is designated first as a busway and then as a light rail. I think it will make sense if we can swing light rail around here. We're not going to get heavy rail out here, but we can get light rail out here. I think using busways, I think some of those ideas around Uber car sharing. I was speaking at Remuera last night, and they've got an amazing cycleway and pathway that will go from up by Merton Road all the way down through Ōrākei and into town. I think we've got to try to treat all of our regions equally in terms of how we apply funding, and we've got to look at what best suits this region. But in terms of rapid transit, the Amity development is the next big development that will help somewhat, not right out to Howick, but it will take some of the traffic off the roads between Howick and where your destination might be. But if you've got ideas about what's best for your community, this is a great opportunity to put them in my ear if you've got suggestions. But, you know, whatever we do, there's no single solution, there's no simple solution, there's probably no cheap solution, but we have to find that solution, because it wasn't too bad for me coming up Pakuranga Highway tonight, but it still took time. And, you know, when you've had a hard day at work, the last thing you want to do is sit in the car, moving along. You know, probably the accident rate should come down, because at 5 kilometres an hour, it's hard to have an accident. Yes?
Gary, I'm sorry, Fred, but we just have Gary in the wings, and then you, Fred.
As I was close to it.
Gary.
Our population is about 1.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
In a few years, it's going to be 3 million.
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
So if you take a very long-term view and you took light rail above the Pakuranga Highway, tollways above the motorways, light rail that made money because it's intense, and tollways above the motorways including the tunnel from the North Shore. Surely there is a solution. But it is a 10-year private enterprise proposition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, surely there are solutions. There are solutions. The first question is a readiness to adopt the best solution, and the second question is how you pay for it. You've implied how you pay for it in part with the question of tollway. The government in today's report acknowledged that there's going to have to be, and I hate it as a Kiwi, but I accept it as something that we have to do. We're going to have some form of road user charge. And why is that? It's for two things. One, for revenue. If it's a public-private partnership, somebody's going to do it, but they're not going to do it for love. They're going to do it because they get paid to do it.
You put the tollway above the motorway.
Yeah.
And the people who will do it, they're out there now.
Yep. You've got that in Los Angeles at the moment, where there's a lane there. If you pay extra, you go up the lane, and it's much freer than the rest of the freeway. And surprise, surprise, people say it's going to cost me $2, but bugger it, I want to get home, and they'll do it. I'm not totally sure that the public-private partnership is the best way yet. And what I talked again to the minister about today is the concept of infrastructure bonds. I was talking to a guy from, of all places, Goldman Sachs about this. He's quite an interesting guy. But he said, look at what the Irish are doing. They don't always do what the Irish do, but with a wife called Moriarty, I do what some of the Irish tell me to do. They take out a long-term infrastructure bond. It's for 100 years. It's very low interest. You can borrow at low interest as central government or local government. It's, you know, maybe 2.3%. And the road user charge funds the interest on the long-term bond. Because when we build these things like light rail, it's not just for us, it's for the next generation and the generation after. So it's like mortgage, you know. People say, oh, you don't want to borrow, you don't want to borrow. We borrow to buy a house because we know it's a long-term investment. We're not going to pay for it in the first year we live in the house. We pay for it over, these days, 40 years that you live in the house. So I think that we're going to have to look at that, and the government's been a bit slow at coming to that, but I think they're starting to move. And
take a trip to Bangkok.
Yeah, where you've got the elevated and the transit system and the motorways. Yeah, and they've got it in Taiwan. It's not new. I'm kind of take me a while to adjust to the idea of having elevated motorways going across the suburbs, particularly if you live on either side of the motorway. But one of the things you have to decide, for example, with the tunnel, is that tunnel going to be for cars? And if it's for cars, what happens when you come out of the tunnel? Is it just going to add to the congestion? You might need to think that it could be a light rail tunnel. But I will, if I'm in the position to make the decision, I'll be looking at what the evidence tells me. It'll be on cost and it'll be on efficiency. And it's got to be something that the government has got to come to the party for. My latest argument to government is, you know, you've got all this growth. What we want is a bit of the extra growth in the GST and a bit of the extra growth in income tax to pay for where the growth is happening. That's reasonable, isn't it? If the growth is happening in Auckland and we've got these expenses in Auckland, shouldn't we get that sort of assistance? Now, I'm going to have to negotiate pretty hard on that, because I've negotiated with finance ministers for the 15 years I was a minister. They're tight-fisted and they're mean and they're hard. You've got to put up a good case, and it's got to have a rational basis to it. Sorry, Fred.
Well, you really mentioned part of what I was going to ask about, the infrastructure bonds. Mm-hmm. But when we talk about infrastructure, it's much more glamorous to talk about light rail, heavy rail, roads and that stuff. Mm-hmm. But the thing that holds back our housing growth are mundane things like sewerage.
Water, wastewater.
I mean, we see this in Christchurch. Now, why don't you get those bonds raised for that sort of infrastructure? And forget the glamour.
Well, it's getting to and from work is probably not glamorous, but it's essential. So I wouldn't write them off as glamour, but you're right. I mean, the other infrastructure, you know, there's a breakdown. We've got to spend $20 billion in infrastructure in the next 10 years. $20 billion. Where's it coming from? Nobody's given me that answer yet. Not quite sure why I want to take this job on, the more I think about it. But wastewater and water is part of that. Water care charges separately, of course, and you pay. What you pay for your water is not just what it costs to deliver the water to your door, but it costs for the new central interceptor that is going to carry the wastewater across the town to Mangere. What they've done out at Mangere, I've got to say, is great. Do you remember the days of midges and smells from Mangere? What a transformation! Yeah, let's give credit to where credit's due. So not glamorous, but we don't even have sedimentation ponds out there now. They've restored the harbour. So that is all important, but Watercare tends to fund that out of their own mechanism. Now, the one thing I've got to say is, John Key sometimes says we've got to sell assets, and Watercare is our most valuable asset. The trouble is that Watercare has a statutory prohibition on paying a dividend. So what you pay for the water is what the water costs to deliver to you and elsewhere. If we privatise Watercare, your water rates are going to go up threefold. Do you really want me to do that? I don't want to do that, and I won't do that.
Are there any other questions? Supplementary.
With the bonds,
It's called a supplementary question in Parliament, yeah.
the bonds you're talking about, there are a lot of people in Auckland now who are sick and tired of going to the bank and getting about 3%.
Yeah, exactly.
They would love to have 5%.
Yeah, you did. I'm going to chisel you down a bit from 5%. I don't want to pay. I don't want to pay that much for it. But you're right about that. Yeah, I mean, instead of investing in the housing bubble, if it's going to be and it's a growing risk, there's a whole lot of people out there that would say, I'd like to put my money into something that gives me a reasonable return, that is secure, and is going to be good for my community. I reckon you could sell infrastructure bonds. I really reckon people will go for that.
Are there any other? Hang on, can I just wait, Gary? There might be somebody.
There's a lady down here. We better get some gender balance here.
Very much, Jackie.
Phil, all the politicians, central government and the big government, no one speaks about our harbour. Why can't we put more ferries on our harbour? Why can't we get ferries going up the East Coast bays and around all the bays here? I just find it incredible that we're talking light rail, buses, cycling, and nobody's speaking about our harbour.
Yeah. No, you're right. The great thing about the harbour is that you don't have to maintain it. It's there. You don't have to fill the potholes in. The ferry services are growing, for example, out to Pine Harbour and Whangaparoa, and of course across the shore into Waiheke. I think the biggest tragedy was that Fuller's had a competitor for a while. It was called Explore, and it's amazing what Fuller's could do when it had a competitor. Suddenly they increased the services and everything was a whole lot better. Unfortunately, Explore has folded, so it's got to be economic, but yeah, I reckon that you can expand those ferry services, and they will expand, and that will be one way of getting people. I'm remiss in not mentioning the ferries. They are. I think they carry about 4%, if I'm right now. Somebody might correct me on that. I think it's about 4%. But yeah, it makes anything that takes people off the roads makes sense to me. But it's also. It's run as a private market operation, and one of the things government I think was a bit mean on doing was that if you were gold card members you could get free travel on Fuller's but you couldn't get it on Explore. And I think you've got to have a level playing field. That's what competition is about. It's about a level playing field. I think they should have equalised it, and then maybe Explore would still be there, maybe not. They got there in the end, but it was very late in the day.
Last question, Bill.
Phil, are the ferry services subsidised?
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that. I think they are. The subsidies vary on different forms of public transport, and the subsidies are coming down in real terms as more people, for example, use heavy rail. That was the most heavily subsidised, but it's increasing by 22% a year, and the value of each trip being subsidised is dropping. But I think ferries are subsidised to some degree, but I can't tell you how much.
Okay, just as a quick mathematical question here. If they were, say, subsidised by a third, and you dropped the fare from today's $9 to get into town, which is ridiculous, dropped it to $3 flat rate right across Auckland. You'd only have to get 3 times as many people using the ferries, quite the same amount of money.
Yeah.
to get people off Pakuranga Highway for a start.
Yeah.
Because it's got to be cheaper.
Yeah.
Public transport will be cheaper than taking your car into town.
Yeah. Well, you could be right. I mean, what you should be trying, you know, I know it'll be more complex than I'm about to say, but again, you should be trying to say we want these different modes of transport to be competitive within themselves, and by a more equal subsidy across them, that will encourage people to go where it makes most sense economically for them to go and for the service to be provided. I know there's going to be a whole lot of difficulties with what I've just said, but what I've just said makes sense to me, and I want people to prove me wrong when I talk to the bureaucrats about it. But you may well be right on that.
I think I cut the gold card and make it $3 trip.
Well, I was going
Yeah.
to ask the most interesting question of all, I thought.
Yeah.
Your point of difference,
Yeah.
moving the harbour from the Waitemata to Onehunga and the Manukau.
So I wouldn't move it to Onehunga. Onehunga is going to be purchased by Auckland, and it'll be a kind of a fisherman's wharf area. It'll be really attractive. It'll be an exciting.
So it wasn't
No,
Manukau Harbour.
no.
My apology.
There's a report by EU which used to be Ernst & Young, and it nominates 5 alternative sites for the port. We haven't talked about the port, so can I just take a minute on this,
You
Madeline?
may indeed.
Yeah. I had to ask. First of all, why would you move the port? The problem with the port in Auckland is that it's going to reach capacity, bulk cargo 3 to 10 years, that's all the cars and stuff like that. I would move the cars out of Auckland, frankly. I think you could do it to Northport. I've talked to the former chief executive of Ports of Auckland. He says the used cars are the ones that clog the place up most. You've got to, once you get them off the port, you've got to ship them to 3 different areas to do different things that you do on the imported used cars. If you did it in Northport, the land is cheap as chips, and you could get the cars to the consumer in Auckland for no greater price. So when we get congestion, I don't want to see the most expensive real estate in New Zealand used as a used parking lot. I think it's dumb, you know. So you can deal with that. But in maybe 20 to 40 years' time, we're going to reach capacity on containers. Now, Ports of Auckland say we just want to reclaim a little bit more, just another 6 hectares, and then we'll give them the 6 hectares, and then we just need a bit more. I believe that we should be not further reclaiming the Waitemata Harbour. I think it's as part of the Gulf, it's the jewel in the crown. And I think to the extent possible, we want to try and give the public access to the waterfront. What is every other major city? You go to Sydney, do they still have a container port in at Darling Harbour or down in the Rocks? Of course not. This is the heart of the city. And they've moved it out to Botany Bay by the airport. Ernst & Young said yes, they haven't published the report yet, but it says yes, capacity means that it should move. But will it move overnight? No, it's 15 to 20 years to actually do the planning and the building of a new port. The next question is, where would you put a new port? And that's the hardest question. They've put up 5 sites, 2 on the Hauraki Gulf, 1 on either side of my batch at Orrery Point, laying aside all personal and private interests. I've got to look at that totally equally. So by Ponui Island and off maybe Kaiawa. And they've got 3 sites in the Manukau, but not in Onehunga Wharf. One is up next to the airport, so you'd link straight into the Wiri industrial area. The other is a platform right out in the middle of the Manukau. And the third is one somewhere in between. Now, the problem with the Manukau, my dad used to be a marine engineer on the ships, so when I was a kid I'd go down, he'd come in on the old Union steamship, so ships can go, the concrete ships are still coming in there, but it's very shallow, and you've got the bar, and we think of the bar, we think of the Orpheus, and we think it's impossible. Engineers tell me they can dredge, but you have to keep dredging because it keeps silting up. The problem with the EU report, EY report, is it doesn't give the definitive answer. And I had that discussion with Mr. Bridges as well this afternoon. I said, well, what we need to do is have a regional port strategy. What's best for the region? Taking the advantages of Tauranga, Whangarei and Auckland. Because we can't make that decision in isolation to what the region needs. Maybe the best port is actually at the Firth of Thames. So you link Tauranga, Auckland and Hamilton, the 3 biggest population centres, or the 3 fastest growing population centres. But that work needs to be done properly. You can't make a decision and we shouldn't be making a decision of letting the port continue to expand until we know what we want to do. And the information's got to be there on the table. My personal thing, if we could get the port out of Auckland, it'd be fantastic. Maybe that we still have a port in Auckland, but it's on a more constricted base. And, you know, I loved what they've done down in the Wynyard Quarter, what we can do on the tank farm. That's going to be fantastic. And